Kia ora, Screenies, and welcome back to another episode of Seeing Me on the Screen. Today's guest is Finlee Rickit-Browning. They are an autistic individual working in the social media space and an amazingly talented illustrator and designer. Let's get into the discussion.
Hi, Finley. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's so exciting to have you.
Yeah.
So, can you start by telling us a bit about your background, both personally and professionally? How did you become interested in communication and social media?
Yeah, so I am a digital specialist and I work in communications. And so I do a bunch of stuff in my work right now, like managing online communities and creating like digital assets for social media and for e-newsletters and that sort of thing. Yeah, and my work especially includes creating information for people who are disabled and who are autistic. I guess some of how I got into this field is I've always been really interested in the way that people communicate. And I think a lot of that comes from in the past as a kid being misunderstood or having trouble communicating myself. And I've always really been interested in finding different ways of communicating the ways that our brain works. Yeah, so that's some of my background.
I can relate to that being justification for doing my Bachelor of Communication as well, being like, yes, if I learn the rules, I will know.
Exactly.
Yes, paying like hundreds and thousands of dollars for people to be like, do things that people can do normally, quote unquote, whatever normal means. So we
Yeah.
talked about this earlier, but transitioning from student life to a full-time job can be challenging for many, especially for autistic individuals. Could you share any strategies or adjustments that have helped you to manage this transition?
Yeah, so I'm going to start off by saying that if you're currently funded by a NASC or anything like that, you can go through a transition program. A lot of NASC's service providers have transition programs that can help you move from one stage of your life to another. So if you're currently in that position, that's a really good way to transition. But also, for me, that's not something I was a part of. I was just living without any extra support. So I found that transition from uni into full-time work really tough. I think the first thing to be aware of is to know that it takes a while before you're really settled in. And if you're feeling really stressed out and really overwhelmed for the first half a year to a year, like that's completely normal, even for neurotypical people. So don't feel too flustered, I guess, by that. But then also, I think it's really important to know to figure out what your limits are within your job and what the things are that stress you out particularly, and like identifying those and knowing what the best ways to work around those are, and knowing like, oh, this type of job really, this part of my job really stresses me out. So I'm gonna do this thing to help me regulate a bit more, or that sort of thing. Yeah. And then the other thing that I've got is there's a neurotypical when you're in like an office environment, for example, that's what I'm working in. There's an autistic way of thinking where we hear that we're working from 9 a.m. till 5 p.m. and we're like, I have to be working 100% productivity within those hours, and that's just not how the average person works.
Yeah.
Like half of office workers say they only put in 4 hours a day out of an 8 hour day. So I guess you have to learn what the right amount of work is for your role and that sort of thing. And yeah, that took me some time
And
as well.
sometimes creative fields, it requires a lot more like thinking and comprehension that takes a lot longer versus writing a report or something to that effect. So that would take a lot longer, and it takes a lot more of your brain power, your little noggin, to come up with original ideas and thoughts and things like that. So
that's true.
request workplace accommodations if you can as well. That's another thing I'd suggest, because especially with hot desking, which means you have the potential of not having a secured seat, which for me, that would stress me out. I must have consistent seat or else I don't do work. So you can always ask. I'd rather have an open line of communication.
For me, that accommodation, the most important one is noise cancelling headphones. So yeah, definitely have that conversation with your manager. And I think at the end of the day, like a good manager is there to make your life easier and to help you do your work as best as you can. That's their job. basically. That's what they're being paid to do. So don't feel ashamed to ask.
Exactly. And take breaks. Even if it's not a quote unquote scheduled break, you can always go and get a coffee, for instance, or go chat to a coworker. You don't have to immediately be like, ah, yes, this is my 50 minutes starting now. And then you're going straight back to work. Apparently that's not a thing that neurotypical people do. Apparently they
Yeah.
take their time getting back to work, or lunch timings. I will always have a timer for 30 minutes or however long. And my coworker was like, why are you setting a timer? And I'm like, because it's 30 minutes. And that's that's my lunch hour. And then they were like, what do you mean? So apparently it's not
Yeah.
structured, which is what I struggled with. You guys don't have the same rigid, it's in the contract. And they were like, you can do what you want. As long as you don't go away for 3 hours or something, they're not going to penalize you for being back within 3 minutes past 1 or whatever. They don't mean exactly 15 minutes or exactly 10 minutes or exactly an hour. It's with a bit of leeway, just a little
Yeah.
teeny.
And the other thing is people will be like, I'm gonna go talk to our other coworker about this thing, but it's 5 minutes was spent talking about this thing and 15 minutes was spent just talking, which is like another break. Yeah.
Social break.
Interesting stuff.
Yeah, getting
Yeah.
away from the desk. Because I'd be like, oh, that conversation would normally take 3 to 4 minutes for the other person to talk about it. And then they're back in 20 minutes. I'm like, what? How long did you talk about technology for? We can talk about digital communities. So digital communities can be a lifeline for many autistic individuals. How have online communities supported you, and what role do they play in your life?
Yeah, so I think for me, I've always been in digital communities. I think my first one was Club Penguin when I was 10, which, yeah, I spent a lot of time begging my parents to get me a membership and that sort of thing, which is a whole nother discussion to be had about monetization of our spaces. But
Mm,
anyway, I think for me, the reason that I'm so active in digital spaces is because I'm seeking people who have similar interests to me
mm,
and who have the same level of hyper focus on those interests.
yes.
Yeah. I'm sure you have that too with your theatre stuff.
Yeah, I do. Think about how many friends
Um,
I've met that are from those groups and that I've gone to meet in person safely, obviously. We were both in New
mhm.
Zealand. And it's so crazy that people, at least one of my friends, we met on a Hades Town fan page, which is a show. And then it was a post of someone being like, hey, what country are you guys from? And then I think it was my friend who put where I'm from New Zealand. And then it ended up that we were in the same area,
It is crazy.
close. And then we finally met in person, and it was talking to someone who knew exactly what I was talking about, going from digital space to then being seen in person and interacting. And we still interact now. It's been 4 or 5 years, and we still talk about shows. We still talk about, I mean, when I went to go see Hades Town, I sent them a picture of me at Hades Town, and they were like, oh my God, because they understood. And that's the best thing
Yeah.
about digital communities.
Yeah, exactly. It's just that everyone there has the same understanding of this thing, and you don't have to coerce anyone to talk
Yeah.
about it. Everyone's excited to be there and to talk about that thing. I think it's really cool.
But I'm just saying that sometimes people would tell me to stop talking about shows. Then it's like telling someone who's just had their limb amputated to not talk about how their limb's been amputated. So to
Yeah.
me, that's really difficult. And I'm assuming that's the case for a lot of people, especially in professional workplace environments where they talk about interests a lot because that's what you care about. And so you try to be like, hey, I like this show. I think you'd like this show. And it's difficult for me to be like, don't do that. That's not professional. You need to be professional and not talk time. Or if your special interest is dinosaurs or something, it might be a little bit more difficult to weave into a conversation about stocks or something in a workplace
Yeah.
environment. So it is
A lot of
awkward.
my interests are like that. Skateboarding, comics, video games. These are not things that feel particularly well suited to an office environment.
Mm.
So, yeah, I do find it tough sometimes to connect. Yeah, it's cool to have a digital space that fills that need in.
And then of course that also depends on the people that are in your office too.
It's hard to strike that balance because they'll ask, what did you do on the weekend?
Yeah.
And the answer is, I played 12 hours of Baldur's Gate, and then how do I make that the right amount of information for them?
In my case, I'd be like, I had rehearsal and we did this and this. But for them, they don't have an understanding of what the show is or what I'm doing or anything like that. It is awkward because especially as it gets closer to show time, it's then going to take up more of my time, which means that if people ask about and we can only be like, we did this at the show and this at the show and this at the show. I don't like to be
Yeah,
perceived as annoying, and kind of
either.
like a lot of internalized ableism is being perceived as annoying or being perceived as other or different or in a negative sense based on how people react to these aspects of difference. Difficult to mediate that and be like, and that's why we
Yeah,
have online communities to be like, yay, here's a space where we can do things and talk about things. And there's no, not to say there's no judgment, because the theatre community can be quite ranty about certain kinds of performers and things like that. But yeah, at least they have a preliminary understanding of what it is that you care about.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think also there's like when I get socially overwhelmed, I tend to stop speaking.
Mm.
But I find that like logging onto like a Discord server or something like that, like a digital space, you don't actually have to speak. First of all, like you can type, but if even you don't want that, you can just send an emote and people will know you're there, but they're like chill. And so I think that's like really, it's hard to find a space like that in the real world.
And even in
Mm.
community spaces like libraries and things like that, they can be quiet most of the time, but sometimes they can have like lots of people, or they might have an event on that you weren't exactly expecting when you want to go to a third space that's nice and quiet. So there's that too. But speaking of digital spaces and social media, things like that, can you share some examples of good inclusive designs and digital spaces for neurodivergent individuals?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this because I was having trouble thinking of an example to
Mm.
give you because I think these like digital spaces end up really tailored to the needs of the people who are using them. And then I was like, oh, that's the example I should be giving you. I've just been involved in setting up a new digital space for a game that a bunch of people are interested in. So there's about 60 of us within this space, and everyone in the like main channel, everyone was typing a lot, everyone's really excited, and some people were finding that really overwhelming. So we created a slow channel where you can only type every 20 seconds or so. So if people were feeling overwhelmed from the main chat, they could go into that separate chat and have a slower discussion. And I realized that's like equivalent to a quiet room or a sensory room, like just off to the side. So I thought that was like an interesting parallel between the needs of autistic people in the physical space and the digital space. So yeah, I guess it's just very much like trying to identify what those needs look like for the individuals in your community and how you can put that into action.
Nice. And we can talk about your amazing artwork as well. So your artwork includes both like band work and original characters. Can you describe your creative process and what themes you explore in your art, which is very amazing?
Thank you. Yeah, so like I said earlier, I'm super interested in the way that people communicate, and I I've grown as a writer recently, but I think I've always been like really strong with visual communication and really interested in like semiotics. So what does a symbol mean and how do people interpret them or understand them? Like a crow can mean death and it's like black, so that's like evil, that sort of thing. It's always been really interesting to me. Yeah. I guess it's interesting to be like an autistic person and be interested in communication because that's like in our diagnostic criteria is we struggle with that, air quotes. But yeah, like I said, I think that comes from wanting to be seen and understood. And so when it comes to my art, I think it's just wanting to have more avenues, as many avenues as I can to be seen and understood by people. And
Mm.
you might not understand the words that I'm saying, but you might understand a drawing or you might understand a written piece with a different targeted audience, or you might see the emotion on an actor's face and it's an emotion that I'm not able to communicate on my own face, and you might be able to understand that experience that I'm trying to explain.
Yeah, I can relate. When you're just talking about expressions, I can relate to that as well. Most of the time, my face is quite neutral or blank, and then when I'm like a character, like if I'm in a show or whatever, then I'm showing the expressions that they're feeling in this moment, even if my normal face doesn't necessarily show that. Like I could be terrified, and the character would show that they're terrified, but if I was terrified I wouldn't really have any kind of reaction. So
Mm,
I find it interesting that it's ironic having a Bachelor of Communications and being
yeah.
autistic. So I'm qualified to talk about communication, even though my difficulties can be in communication. And also that depends
Hmm.
on the type of communication as well. I'm currently pointing at my giant shelf that has all my book art on it. The audience at home can't see this, but you can understand that he's a grumpy boy. There's
Oh,
a picture of the Grinch from How the Grinch Stole Christmas in a book, and it's got a very grumpy face on it. I can't do that grumpy face, but I have a book here that shows the grumpy face. So that's the point of
yeah.
comparison I'm making.
Audience, you should be very jealous that I got to see that and you didn't.
Who's the social media entrepreneur now? Also, I'm probably going to put links to your art in the description, by the way.
Okay,
That way,
cool.
people can come see your amazing art. So there's that. You can't escape. You're going to get little friends coming to see your art after I've hyped it up so
Yeah.
much this episode.
Woohoo.
Woo! So, can you
Woo.
share any examples of media that you feel have done a good job representing autistic individuals and why these examples stand out to you? Or if you want, you can do a negative rant on negative autistic representation.
I'll hit you with both. So I think everyone who has come on this podcast has said before, Heartbreak High was really cool.
Yeah.
And I think that the reason that it spoke to me is because Quinny's story is really centered. She has her own agency as a character. And
Mm.
opposite of that, I think, is a show like Atypical, which I also really enjoyed.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
I think Atypical centralizes the parent's perspective in a way that leaves Sam's character without a lot of agency.
Mm.
And so I think that's the difference between those two shows in terms of representation. Yeah.
I agree
But
I agree about
yeah.
Atypical. It's interesting because what happens when you cast a non-autistic person as an autistic character, but at the same time they were trying to remedy that in the later seasons by incorporating actually autistic people in his support group, and I thought that was interesting. Even if the main person cast isn't autistic, not to say that everyone supports the show, but it was very interesting with them responding to the backlash, understandably, of having a non-autistic person playing an autistic role, but then being like, okay, we can incorporate some more of these elements and have these people have their own, even if they're little minor characters. It's the thought that counts sometimes, to be like better than nothing, but at the same time, it's at least they took the criticism on. That doesn't mean that they're absolved of any fault, however. At least they were trying to make a conscious effort.
It is cool. It is cool. Yeah, I guess it's one of those things when we talk about autistic people playing autistic characters, there's the actions that we don't just come from nowhere, right?
Mm.
We don't stim for no reason and we don't all these other things. And there's behaviors that we do that a neurotypical person will just never understand,
Mm.
even no matter how much research they do, you'll never get it. But because our brains just work different. And it's
Yeah.
the same, there's things neurotypical people do that I will never understand because our
Yeah.
brains work different. So
Eye contact discuss. I can't look at people in the
anyway,
eye. I have to look at them here if I'm making eye
yeah.
contact and like in between the eyebrows. And I'm assuming that typical people don't do that. Or the audacity, honestly. Imagine making eye contact. That's disgusting.
Yeah, it's gross. I have one more media to share.
Yeah.
There's a really cool short film called Hikaru Hitaringa, which is Eyes and Ears. It's done by a Kiwi filmographer, videographer, whatever. And it's shot from the perspective of this young autistic boy who so we see through his eyes and through his ears, which is why
Mm.
it's titled that. And you see him experience a construction site, and that stresses him out. And he is interested in dinosaurs. So he's at this doctor's office with his mum, and
Mm.
you don't quite know what's going on because he's distracted by the dinosaur that he's playing with.
Mm.
And so I just think the storyline of the short film is going through a diagnostic experience with a mother who doesn't know anything about autism. She just
Mm.
knows that there's something happening with her son, and a son who's too young to engage with the system. And it's about how our system's not set up to support people, and the response from the doctors is not particularly useful for them. That's Hikaru Hitaringa. It's available through request from Learn Films, and I think it's like a really great piece. I think everyone should go and have a look at
Mm.
that one. And the filmmaker, I've spoken to him before, he's super cool. And as a kid, he was nonverbal except for movie quotes. So that was the only way he could communicate.
Are there any particular policies, practices, or books that you found helpful about any of the topics we've discussed today to recommend to our listeners?
So I've got a big list of stuff.
Yeah.
I'm not really a book person, but I'm happy to give you a couple of newsletters. The Wild of Brain Substack by Anissa. She's a Kiwi. She's really cool. She's like a life coach, and she's experienced burnout, and she writes some really interesting pieces on how autistic burnout affects. So she's worth checking out. Another one from New Zealand is Reasonable Accommodations with Rebecca Corlett, which is also a Substack. But the thing I like about her daughter is, I think, a non-speaking autistic who I think the thing I like about Rebecca's work is that she has like a boots on the ground kind of approach to it. It's not you're thinking about these higher issues. It's this is the problems that are affecting our community and this is the solutions that we've found. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. The other thing I have is if you're an organization and you're looking to better support autistic people in your workplace, you need to look into the EGL principles. So that's enabling good lives. And it's basically about supporting people to live their best life as a disabled person. And they're like essential if you're writing disability policy, full stop. You have to go and read them.
Yeah.
That's my soapbox.
That's a great soapbox to be on. But yeah.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of Seeing Me on the Screen. If you like this episode, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow on the podcast episode. Thank you so much. See you in the next one. Bye.